and there is and the Great Liberty Hurricane of 1935 on others on the list as well. Now, the deadliest Bahamian hurricanes, you might wonder, well, the Great Okeechobee Hurricane is the deadliest. That's followed by the Great Bahamas Hurricane of 1866. And second is the Great Bahamas Hurricane of, the third is Great Bahamas Hurricane of 1899. In the 1866 hurricane, 387 persons were killed. This storm decimated the Bahamas. And the only storm that did more damage to the Bahamas than this, I think, would be the Nassau Hurricane of 1926. Because this 1926 hurricane and the 1866 hurricane had a similar track, and it impacted every single island. And back then, when hurricanes struck the Bahamas, you can be assured there would be significant death toll and a lot of property damage, because we didn't have radios to warn them about impending hurricanes, and second, didn't have building codes. Building codes never came about until after the Great Abaco Hurricane of 1932. What happened is that after the 1926 hurricane, there was 258 persons in the Nassau Hurricane of 1926, and there was 3 hurricanes in 1926. The next hurricane, the Miami Hurricane, approximately 100 persons were destroyed, most of them at sea. And the 1929, which had 134 persons. The residents of the Family Isles bitterly complained to the governor and to the Great Britain that a lot of their families were being lost in these storms. So what they did after the 1929 hurricane, they sought a way to start documenting the hurricanes, also insisting on building codes being established throughout the Bahamas. And third, they got a radio station. I don't know many of you might hear it, but ZNS. ZNS came about because of these storms. If it were not for these storms, you would not have ZNS. ZNS, the first and only mandate of ZNS at time, which came about in the 26th of May of 1936. The sole mandate was basically to prevent loss of lives on the island. And after ZNS came, many persons on the Family Isles got radios and tuned in to a great deal to those radios to listen for storm warnings about the impending storms. So after the 1933 hurricane season, which saw a few persons died in the Bahamas, called the Treasure Coast Hurricane, there was not much death. Betsy, I think, was 2, Donna was 1, and after that was Andrew, which was 4, and 3 of those were killed. So we never saw the amount of deaths after the radio station ZNS was established, and it did the job perfectly. I'd warned those persons, and most of the persons, because back then the number one industry was sponging, and many of the boats went out at sea not knowing a storm was traveling. Sometimes they went out for weeks, sometimes up to 6 weeks at a time. Some of the sponge fishermen would tell me they would go out 6 weeks at a time, and they would not know a hurricane was coming. They would have a barometer on the boat. Some of them had a barometer. A barometer was very expensive back then, but every fisherman had a barometer on the boat. And once they saw a steep, significant drop in the atmospheric pressure, they came back into land, immediately back in land. The problem with that is that once you start to feel the effects of the storm, it's basically a little late, unless you're near an island. And one of them, in one case, there's a ship called the Brontes, which was sailing from Nassau to San Salvador. That was caught in the 1926 hurricane. And there's another ship that was going from the Mountain King, and that was traveling from Nassau to Cat Island. And I think 28 persons in one storm and 26 in the other storm died in that storm because they were caught in the storm. So incidents like that was a normal thing, or persons who went out on sea. Another example, there's a boat called the Cherry Wine. It sailed from Mango Creek in South Andrews, and 10 persons were lost in that storm. And if you read my book, The Great Bahamian Hurricanes of 1899, and 1932, you'll see, I have a list of names of persons who died. And that's one of the storms that I named the persons who died. And if you look at it, you see that the significant death toll that was occurring from these storms. And thankfully that has changed now with modern technology. We have computers, we can watch a hurricane as it comes off the African coast, as it comes to the Caribbean and over area. We know days in advance of the projected track. Sometimes the tracks are not accurate, but compared to the technology of the 20s, it's significantly more accurate than then. And in fact, the Okeechobee hurricane, they misforecast the storm. They thought the hurricane would turn away from the Florida coast. All the meteorologists on record saying that it's going to turn away, but it didn't, and it devastated Florida, caught many Florida residents by surprise. And the major hurricanes of the Bahamas, I basically gave a list of names. Wilma of 2005 had 75 to 110 persons. Francis, 96 to 100. And if you notice, up to last storm, David was 70 to 80 miles per hour. Hurricane Betsy was 125. Hurricane Donna was 150 miles per hour. And that was gusting to 175 miles per hour. The Great Abaco Hurricane of 1932 was one of only 3 hurricanes that hit the Bahamas at Category 5 intensity. And that followed by Andrew. In fact, Andrew was never upgraded until 10 years later, after 1992. Using modern technology, they realized that that storm was more stronger than they forecast, and they upped it to a Category 5 from a Category 4. And as you can see, for most of the storms in 1929, 1926, 1920, those were like 140 mile per hour winds. And those are extremely strong. We've never had any storms as strong as those ones prior. These are Bahamian migrant workers working on farms in 1926. These are others washing the oranges on the farms, preparing them for packaging and shipping. And these are some migrant workers waiting at the International Labour Institute to get to look for jobs in the Florida area. And this is a worker, migrant worker, basically gathering celery stalks for shipment. And this is one of the things that they did in the 1928 hurricane. The death toll was so great, and they burned some of the bodies, they buried some, and what happened, the ground was so saturated that the bodies would pop back up out of the dirt. And it came back out, and so some of them, they couldn't do much because the ground was saturated for almost several weeks after that. And they couldn't do, so they burned many bodies, and in mass graves, one mass grave at Tamarind Hill and 25th Avenue in West Palm Beach, they built 3 mass graves for the victims, the black victims. And if you're familiar with Zora Neale Houston's book, The Eyes of Watching God, that was the storm that they were talking about. This storm, the Okeechobee hurricane, was the storm that she wrote about. And it's a bestseller even to this day after she died. Yeah, some of the workers those are persons in the background of persons who died. And that's basically it. And thank you for listening. I'll take any questions that you have.
When did they start applying categories?
Categories was in 1973.
73.
Yes, they named after. Actually, the research work was done in 1970 by a gentleman by the name of Herbert Saffer. Herbert Saffer wrote the foreword for my 3rd book on hurricanes, and he gave it to Robert Simpson, who was the then director of the National Hurricane Center, and they devised a table. And they devised the table in 1971, but it was never used until 1973. And it was pretty good. And it was only modified about 3 years later. It's not called the Saffer-Simpson scale anymore. It's named the Saffer-Simpson Hurricane Wind Scale. And they've changed the name because they used to have, if you're familiar with the scale, they used to have damages sustained with each category storm. For example, trees were blown off, leaves or smoke would rise, different characteristics, maybe a roof was blown off, or catastrophic failure. They realized that with those definitions, it caused problems because depending on the position and strength of the hurricane, a Category 1 hurricane with less winds would do more damage than a Category 5, which passes over a city, would do more damage than a Category 5, which would go near maybe less populated areas. So they took that out for accuracy, and because they were being sued by a lot of the insurance industries, a person was suing the United States government for misrepresenting them.